Hi, I'm Jesse Hirsh, and I'm here with my good friend Allan Gregg, and this is the Red-Tory podcast, recorded live in front of an automated audience. And this is our second episode, and I think today we're going to touch upon tariffs and crypto and maybe a whole bunch of other subjects. But because it's our second episode, you know, we're still going to have a very laid-back vibe in terms of it's two golfing revolutionaries having a chat and trying to make sense of what's going on with the world. So, you know, why don't we start in general with the news? Allan, what have you been looking at this week, other than the obvious, in terms of what you think we should be talking about?
Well, again, as a Canadian, you can't not be consumed with the issue of tariffs. I mean, the impact, 70% of, all of our trade worldwide goes to the United States. Our relationship with the United States, the supply chain integration is massive. And then also you've got the larger, I think, conundrum is that Canadians just don't have a frame of reference to understand what's going on. And it's not just the mindset of Donald Trump that is befuddling to Canadians. It's the fact that mindset is deemed somehow acceptable. Gwynn Dyer had a great line one time. He says, Canadians don't understand the United States because half of it is exactly like Canada. Boston is just like Toronto. There's no difference. He says the other half is exactly like Tehran. It's backwards. It's overly religious. It's mired in superstition and acrimony and animus. And Red Deer is not like Biloxi, Mississippi. We don't have any equivalents to that. So the fate of poor Canada in the face of first the pummeling, saying our prime minister should be a governor and Canada should be a 51st state, and then just the sheer economic consequences, and then at the third level, just the befuddlement.
Well, and, right before we started, you actually broke news to me, which is for now, these tariffs have kind of been punted a month to March.
Yes.
Did you get a sense as to the logic behind that, other than it being a kind of a bully stick?
Well, I mean, I've always believed that this threat of there's two levels of threat. I mean, one is the transactional immediate one, which is I'm going to, on February 1st, implement a 25% tariff on all goods coming from Canada and Mexico. The notion that this was as a consequence of our bad behavior in terms of the inflow of illegal immigrants and fentanyl is ludicrous because Canada's contribution to those problems is 1% of Mexico, that we would be in the same boat. The second tier is a much larger review of trade policy in the United States due to come out on April 1st. And the two are linked. There's no question that the first, the 25%, is leverage for the second, which is the larger review, which is going to be a wholesale re-examination of the Canada-US-Mexico trade agreement, an agreement that Trump's administration negotiated last time, and he called one of the best deals in the world. But it's obvious their intention is to not just open that up for renegotiation, but to renegotiate with a temper the likes of which we have never seen. I think that things like Canada's limits on foreign ownership, which we have in our entire banking system and our telecommunication system and our transportation system, will all be up for negotiations, never had been before. Supply chain management in the agricultural sector is going to be a dodo bird. It is going to be gone. We will not be able to sustain that and still have a free trade agreement with the United States. And I think they will push as far as looking for a kind of a continental trade union, much like the EU, that would actually have a common currency on the table as part of that negotiation. So we're just seeing the first shoe drop here, I think.
And the pace at which these shoes are dropping, I think, is part of what's taking people by storm. Now, one other example to this that I'd love you to unpack, because you've had a lot of experience in the North American auto industry, and where all the public dialogues focused on like groceries and the impact that tariffs will have on consumer goods, it strikes me the auto industry is particularly vulnerable to these types of bidirectional border tariffs because their production process is distributed across the entire continent. If these were to go through, what kind of impact is it going to have on the companies, in Detroit and that have the manufacturing distributed in such a manner?
Listen, I mean, the North American automotive supply chain is so integrated across the three nations, I don't know if they could even calculate a tariff because the average auto part crosses a border 6 to 9 times. And that's just how we make vehicles. And if you don't think that General Motors and Ford and what used to be Chrysler have got some continuing influence in governments and lobbying, I mean, you're underestimating just how much they're going to be screaming bloody murder. Which is why I also think, for the very same reason, is that the 25%. I mean, 70% of all our exports to the United States go to make other things that American businesses make. So that's going to add to the cost of American business right away, and that will lead to the hue and cry from all of these local U.S. chambers of commerce, screaming to their Congress people about just how awful these tariffs are. For at the time, they have no kind of appreciation or full understanding of what that actual impact will be, much like, as you suggest, it would be in the North American automotive industry.
Well, and that's why I'm partial to your narrative about there's an end game around a larger economic pact, because the pushback has been large and the pain would have been felt, by a lot of states, including red states, that could have backfired. But I also keep looking at these moves, as a logician, because a lot of this just doesn't seem to make sense unless you couch it in this larger kind of consolidation of executive power. That the other, to me, argument for why this pace is so fast, why these guys are moving fast and breaking things, is because they're trying to create precedent and, going so fast that no one could question the increasing authority of the president and the powers of the president. Because the other story that I've been watching this week is Elon Musk's seizing control of the purse strings.
Yeah.
Right. Of taking the power that legally is supposed to reside with Congress. But and it's interesting, Anonymous leaked the names of the Doge staff, the young people working with him who now have the passwords for the Social Security system, a lot of the payment system within the government, and Wired published it. But again, it's inappropriate for the executive branch to have that kind of power, and I'm waiting for the Democrats in Congress to say something about it, because that's where I'm seeing is a real change in the role of executive power in the United States.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think that, that Trump was immensely frustrated by his first term in office, not just because he didn't know how the system worked, but he believed the system was actually working against him and his agenda. And so, tearing down those ramparts, I think, is clearly part of the plan. That said, they've got two big things working against him. One is that, Americans enjoy chaos no more than Canadians. And this is chaotic. I mean, it truly is, in an unanticipated way that no one said, "Well, I saw this coming." Just the way it is, and that chaos will lead to. I mean, the very reason that he was elected was because people were so unhappy with the status quo. Well, if they become more unhappy with the status quo because of that chaos, his approval ratings will start going down very, very quickly. And this is a guy who lives by the stock market and his approval ratings. The second is that we underestimate just what important guardrails are found inherently in our civic society, and that isn't just the different orders of government and the checks and balances in government, but it includes, things like local chambers of commerce in terms of the YMCA, in terms of, the Baptist Church, and that people's involvement. I mean, you sent me a TikTok video the other day, which you included on your Substack. And here's one I wasn't familiar with at all, but she's a fantastic soul singer, singing stuff that came right out of the civil rights movement. And it's a call to action. And, you see that sort of stuff happening at that kind of micro level. and then it starts to amplify and amplify and amplify. You'll see the same kind of resistance as you saw to the Gilded Age at the turn of the century. You saw against the establishment during the recession in the United States, and it will not wear well on Donald Trump and his concentrators of power because that will be a big target of the unhappiness.
Well, and I'm starting to hear kind of mention of what's loosely being called an American Spring for exactly that reason.
Yeah.
There was a demonstration this weekend in downtown Los Angeles where they completely took over the 110, and it was very peaceful. But it was popular. It was a lot of people sort of on the streets making themselves known. And what concerns me is the extent to which Trump and leaders like him need scapegoats, right? And they need to blame things on someone. And I kind of wonder, on the one hand, I love protests. I love mass movements. I love to see people in the streets. But a part of me wonders how much of it is potentially a trap, given the way in which, if things go sideways, as one would expect they would, because it's America, that it could fuel his narrative further in terms of, to your point, deflecting the disapproval ratings by focusing on Antifa or focusing on, other, in the 1950s, it was communists.
Other disruptors, sure.
Yeah.
And talking, much as Nixon did, with the silent majority. These people who are protesting in the streets do not represent middle America and the average person. And the average person would say, well, yeah, that's true. So, I mean, it's the dynamic now is very, and we talked about this in our pilot, that the yardsticks are not measuring the same things as they used to. And we're in uncharted territory here, especially if we use the old yardsticks. And so, will public protest, will the spring, as you called it, have the same kind of reaction as it did to, in the 70s? Or will it be something quite different that it might really inspire? I mean, again, we talked about young people. Young people are not right-wingers by nature. They are just angry. They are mad, really, really mad. And if the right wing is expressing their madness, a little bit better than the left wing, then they're going to be echoing that expression. So we'll have to see, but I think the notion that things will just kind of bump along as they always have is completely specious. Keep your eyes open, folks.
Well, and let's evoke the kind of inner James Carville that lives in all of us. Where is the Democratic Party right now? How should they be playing this moment? And I think we could all understand why they're flat-footed and kind of still going, I don't know what's going on. But at some point, they got to wake the fuck up.
Yeah, I think they're licking their wounds right now, the big period of introspection. I mean, you're starting to see now the new chair of the Democratic caucus, Democratic chairman, again, saying we have to get blue-collar workers back. I mean, Franklin Delano Roosevelt would be rolling over in his grave. He said, "What, would Republicans have blue-collar voters?" And that is incomprehensible, and in some ways, it's completely irrational. What blue-collar workers have in common with what you've called the bro oligarchy, all of the people who are now glomming on to Trump, is nothing, absolutely nothing. In fact, their interests are at absolute, loggerheads with one another. And the other thing, I think, the problem with the Democrats and we touched on this a little bit before too, and progressives, is they assume, because they have no frame of reference to understand Donald Trump, that anyone who supports Donald Trump is a lunatic, and they treat them like lunatics. And the response is reciprocal. You treat me like I'm a lunatic, fuck you. You're gonna have nothing to do with you. Over 80 million Americans voted Donald Trump. They're not all QAnon. They're not all crack brains. They're not all siege the Congress. These are a lot of people with very legitimate grievances that the Democrats have not been able to address. It's the guy, who was a coal miner in West Virginia, who had two vehicles, whose kids are still living at home at the age of 35, with no prospect of employment, and him now being out of work, and he's just saying, who represents me? Who's standing up for me? And the answer is surely not those Democrats.
Although, and I agree with you, there's a second dynamic to this, and I think we could sort of segue to cryptocurrency as a tangible example. George Lakoff, who's a brilliant psychologist, linguist. Yeah, he talks about how you can have parallel circuits in the brain, that you can hold completely contradictory positions, but it's often because they're literally separated in terms of how you think about them. And I kind of feel that the MAGA right has been separated from the rest of us from a media perspective, from a media experience perspective. They're listening, they're consuming, they're participating in an entirely different media ecosphere than we are. I think podcasting is the bridge. I think podcasting is where there's a lot of overlap. But other than that, even social media now, X is going one direction, Blue Sky is going in another. Like, it's no longer the cliche of filter chambers, or rather echo chambers and filter bubbles. It's now the cliche of different social media platforms entirely. Right. Yeah. So actually getting to these people, and this is where, the big tech is really leaning hard right into the Trump regime, because these people are very stable users. They're using Facebook all the time. They're using social media all the time, versus, who I think of as yourself, my parents, some of the other friends who would identify as anywhere from the center to the left. A lot of you are still watching MSNBC. You're still reading the Globe and Mail. You're still writing for the Toronto Star. And I understand why, in terms of your values for journalism in a democratic society. But we are going to have to go into new territory to reach those 80 million you mentioned, because they've completely disconnected, and they will probably continue to disconnect from that mainstream discourse and are part of a completely different discourse, of which I think crypto is a really powerful example.
Well, before we get to crypto, I mean, there's no question there's been a massive disintermediation of communications, and the notion that there is a common experience like we used to have when we watched the last episode of MASH, the rich data. But I mean, or even Super Bowl game and it led to what we called, the water cooler conversation on Monday morning. I mean, you watched Ed Sullivan's show and said, what do you think of those Beatles? And so you had a common ground right away there. And there has been this disintermediation. That said, and again, it's because the big generation is still a big generation, legacy media still has a role. What's distressing is that even the legacy media is becoming increasingly siloed. I mean, I don't need Rachel Maddow to lecture me for 38 goddamn minutes, at 11 o'clock at night, pretending that she's smarter than I am, when clearly she is not, and it's as much as on the Fox News side. And you just go, how did this happen? How did you get, a host who offers their view on the question before they ask the question? And, that's also, I think, a huge problem in our understanding, is that if you can't go to a traditional source of authority, i.e. the news and journalists, and expect, a more objective, impartial, or at least balanced, and I know those are three very, very, very different things, point of view, then you really do end up. I mean, I've got a father-in-law who only watches Fox News. He would never know. And he's quite happy doing that, every night of the week, and just drinking the Kool-Aid.
Although, I mean, I think, because it's our second issue, so we can be ambitious, part of what we're aspiring to do is stay out of those silos, right? Is maintain a level of credibility, maintain a level of authenticity, even authority, but not through objectivity. I think we're more approaching this from a humble subjectivity, where we're disclosing that subjectivity. And that's where I like our frame, that we're researchers, in the sense that we're curious, but we also, as researchers, have to at times, say, here as a researcher, how I might be conflating my research or tainting what I'm doing, right? Which I think is a much more accessible approach to an audience, because you're not abandoning that objectivity. Sorry, go ahead.
And it's not that you don't have ideology. You're just not in the straitjacket of ideology.
Yes.
And that's why we're Red-Tory.
Yes.
You can be both things if you're thinking.
I got to ask you, though, on the point of the MASH and the TV moments, did you happen to watch the Jake Paul Mike Tyson fight on Netflix?
No, I didn't. I gave it a pass. But again, there was a joining moment. I understand.
Well, and
the stock went up.
And it was absurd. Like, as far as society of the spectacle goes, we could do better than that. Like, if we're gonna have breads and circuses, our circuses need to be far more capable. But I'm curious. Our last episode we talked about crypto, and that kind of influenced the post that I had on Substack.
Yes, today, and you should talk about that, because that was quite radical in terms of what your prognostications are. I mean, the notion that there is, an actual, no, I don't call it conspiracy, that's too strong a word, but there is an actual plan to move to cryptocurrency as a more legitimate form of financial market in the United States. Again, driven by, if not driven by Donald Trump, certainly abetted by Donald Trump and driven by others who are part and parcel of the crypto and Bitcoin world. Talk to our listeners a little bit about that, because it was fascinating.
Well, I'm really trying to come up with a sort of political economy, as it were, of crypto. There have been a lot of people who have been critical about it on a technological level, on a policy level. But I just think about, why is the US dollar worth the US dollar? It's because people buy and sell it. And if you have more, like if you are the Federal Reserve and you've got lots and lots of dollars, then you can intervene in the market to keep the currency stable. And most people don't realize that the Bitcoin market, the entire crypto market, is heavily concentrated into a few hands, right? There are people who are like, again, the way the Federal Reserve or the way that the Bank of Canada has an outsized position in currency markets, there are actors within the Bitcoin economy who have even more outsized influence, but they're individuals. They're just people. So they're not subject to government policy. They're not subject to scrutiny. It's not transparent, but it's not secret either. It's kind of obfuscated. But here's where I'm hypothesizing that an Elon Musk, I safe bet he has a very large crypto position, partly because Doge, D-O-G-E, is a cryptocurrency that he loves, that he's been championing for years. So of course he names this silly government initiative after the cryptocurrency that he wants to go to the moon, which is their slogan, right? And of course he bought Bitcoin, or had Bitcoin, when it was pennies.
Now, before we get to the speculation, though, I mean, you cite in this article an executive order that I was not aware of, that basically prohibited the state, that is the Federal Reserve, getting into this space. Tell us more about that.
So there is, and we mentioned this a little last episode, there is a threat that a lot of these libertarians fear, which is that more states start entering into their sandbox. Right. And in entering into their sandbox, creating rules, creating legislation that decides, well, only the central bank can engage in these digital currencies because the state has given it a monopoly, the way that states can have monopolies on violence or, banking licensing. And this was really, it was the libertarian side of the Republican Party that has gotten Trump over to the crypto. And they said, we want to make sure that the government stays out, that they're not allowed to be involved. And they also, as part of this executive order, removed any of the regulations that have been passed on
existing Bitcoin users. Now, stop there, because I think this is hugely important, because I know, given your anarchist background, you tend to be a little wild and out there. If there's a red on this side, it's you more often than me. And the notion that there is this kind of plot on the part of the oligarchs who own Bitcoin to become, trillionaires, not just billionaires, I don't know so much. Looking at this executive order, however, that puts a very, very different picture on it, because what you haven't mentioned again over the course here, because it's so obvious to you, is that Bitcoin, unlike the money supply, is a finite commodity. There's only so much of it out there. And so that the value, it is not a supply demand, it's all demand, because the supply is, finitely defined. The more demand there is, the more it goes up exponentially against that demand.
Which is why many people have called Bitcoin a scam as a monetary system. But to be clear, you were the one who keeps using the word plot. I use the word political economy. What Bitcoin is a corporation that people have bought into. And if you have shares in a corporation, you are naturally incentivized to want to see that corporation succeed. And the thing about Bitcoin is that it has always been an ideological corporation. It has always, in its founding and its support, had a libertarian view of society, that we don't want government controlling money, that we don't want any institution like Wall Street controlling markets. And that's why on some level, Bitcoin is democratized, because it is like $1, one vote. But I'm pointing out there are people who have a lot of those dollars. So therefore, they have a lot of those votes. So it's not a conspiracy. It's not a plot. It's a corporation, again, for lack of a better word, that a lot of the nerds that I've been around, because I first explored Bitcoin in 2011. Right. And hosted in 2013, I hosted the Toronto Bitcoin Summit and charged people $1 Bitcoin each to come and teach me about Bitcoin. And like all this time, I've been seeing them have this very political view of the world. And
if you
now
would have kept those Bitcoins, you would be richer than you are now.
But the nature of being a revolutionary, right, is you have to. No, I regret it. But what can you? Go ahead.
Stop there for a second, because I've always discounted the not just the legitimacy, the longevity of cryptocurrency. And the reason for this is the whole notion of currency, whether it's paper currency or cryptocurrency, is an artificial construct. It doesn't exist. It's a replacement for the old barter system, where if you came and tilled my field, I gave you a cow, and you took that cow to the butcher, and the butcher gave you 10 steaks and 4 jugs of beer. And the reason it worked, the barter system, is because you believed that the butcher was going to give you something, not turn you away. They're not taking Bitcoin at Circle C or at 7-Eleven right now, because they do not trust Bitcoin. And what I'd always assumed, and I get the whole blockchain and the understanding that it's a very efficient system, in fact, in terms of accounting and what have you, that at some point in time, what governments would do is say, fine, we're all going digital. It's a messy, stupid. I mean, Elon Musk was saying, again, it costs 2.4 cents to make a penny, apparently. and there's 230 billion of them out there. So maybe, a lot of the currency that we have been using is ridiculously inefficient in 2025, and we should go to a digital form of currency. And once that happened, Bitcoin and all the other cryptocurrencies would be absolutely valueless. They would be nothing. That's what I've always held. Your article today said, hold on, smart guy. This is what they can do. They can issue an executive order that says, no, you're not allowed to do that. We're going to keep this in the private sector. We're going to keep this as a corporation. We're going to keep this as a finitely defined supply of currency. And if we should be scared of anything, that's what we should really be scared of. Because as you note in your article, the implications of that for, world trade, for monetary policy all over the world is stunning. Because the American dollar right now it does have that primacy, and it has that primacy, going back to what I was saying earlier, because it's trusted.
Yes.
You know that if you take an American dollar, someone's going to give you the equivalent back.
And there's 2 implications there. One, that they are deliberately trying to mess with the world reserve currency.
Yes.
Which is foolish on a policy level, but they're seeing BRICS in the rearview mirror, right? They're seeing Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which is a growing international governance project. I've been listening to a bunch of podcasts on it. It's really quite fascinating. And BRICS is gaining a lot of popularity in the global south, a lot of popularity, its credibility. So this is a way for, not only for American capitalists to cash in by privatizing the world's reserve currency, but by speaking to the elites of all those countries, saying, look, you can't trust your governments. Trust us, the global corporation of capitalists who've created our own world reserve currency that no government ostensibly will be able to control. A debate I think we should have in the future. But my other point is, this is your neo-feudal regime, because those of us who have our savings in dollars, those of us who have, are living in the dollar economy, while these guys create the crypto economy, it then does create a two-tiered economy. It creates a two-tiered financial system.
Explain something else to me then, and that because this is new territory for Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump is older than I am, for Christ's sake. I mean, he is not a cutting edge techno guy or someone who understands what this is going on. How has he fallen so in the thrall of these guys, these Elon Musks and these Paul Thiels and Peter Thiels and this crowd who he's now appointing to these kind of positions that are going to have authority over issues such as this, the use of cryptocurrency? I
mean, I think the obvious answer is graft. Like, he did that Trump meme coin and then the Melania coin, which they both made a lot of money from. So I think he understands that this is a source of income. I think the AI stuff may be how these tech guys are manipulating him, because AI is such a meaningless yet powerful story that they could go, oh yeah, we're going to build AI, boss. Oh, don't worry.
In as much as it's predicted to be a driver of productivity, a massive driver of productivity. Yeah.
So I could see him, and this is where I'll say two things. I used to think that blockchain was legit, but the more I dug into it, the more I realized this is not how we would do digital currency. I agree with you. We do need digital currency. We do need a form, of an online payment that is seamless. I do think, as an aside, that Trump wants to go after Interac. I think they very much want to open up the Canadian banking market, because Interac, as a Canadian e-transfer capability, is something the Americans are very much wanting to get into. But I think Trump doesn't. I think Trump cares about power. I think these guys see the long-term game. I think they're the ones pushing this. I was being facetious when I talked about Bitcoin replacing the dollar. But I also want to be able to say I called it. So I thought, to that point, I'm going to come up with the most ludicrous extension of logic that I can on this issue. And it's not that ludicrous if you just think about people wanting to make money. Now, one last thing. We did get listener feedback from David Fingroot. Hey, David. And he wanted to reference a book for you, Allan, by David Graeber. And I think it's called The History of Debt. And I'll send you the exact reference. And in this book, David Graeber argues that debt came before barter. And anyway, it was an interesting argument. Kind of went over my head. But I do want to encourage listener and viewer feedback. Yeah. So please.
Well, let me give you something back then, David, because it sounds like a non sequitur. But for me, one of the most brilliant people who are still alive is Margaret Atwood. And her brilliance is not just in her writing ability in fiction. I mean, the themes that she's identified so far in advance of them happening in society. I mean, I was called Jesse, a genius techno-cultural anthropologist. She is in a field all by herself. In 2000, I think it was 2007 or 2008, she did the Massey Lectures, which is a series of lectures that run across the country. And it was called Payback. And the entire thing, this is like 1 year in advance of the financial meltdown. The entire lecture series was about money and currency and what it is and what role it takes in literature, what role it's taken in history. And it's just sheer brilliance. So there you go back. You can read that, and I'll read the book that you're suggesting, The History of Debt.
Right on. Although, be careful. We don't want to get into a poker match with reading and our audience. They will outnumber us sooner rather than later, Alan, and we won't be able to keep up with all their readings.
Oh, that's wishful thinking.
Now, I do want to flag a topic for future discussion that I was thinking about when we were talking about the tariffs and we were talking about young people and Trump. One of the things I've seen a lot online, and especially this weekend, is a kind of ageism, and particularly an anti-boomer ageism. And I want to unpack that partly because we are labeling this podcast as intergenerational. And I think that would be something interesting for us to unpack and set as a thread moving forward. Because I didn't know the extent to which the White House was hiding Biden's cognitive decline. But I was otherwise upset that they turfed him, right? Like I am as this.
He's a good human being. There's no question. A good person.
Yeah, and as the son of someone who practices geriatrics and has been, arguing against ageism his entire career, I'm very sensitive to the idea that we cannot discriminate based on age. And I worry that that Trump is becoming a face for the boomers, that MAGA is becoming a face for the boomers, because I am seeing this come up again and again and again, and it's something I kind of want us to address.
Let's talk about that, because I mean, what I've said historically is exactly the opposite. Is that what's happened is that big generation had been in the crosshairs of public life, for their entire life. I mean, Paul McCartney was famous when he was 18 years old. And he's still famous when he's 80 years old. You look at Polestar that ranks the ticket sales for live music over 2024. 60% of the acts are over the age of 60. We have shifted all the social iconography in society. We've redefined what's old. We've redefined what's young, and we've redefined how you're supposed to behave when you're at different ages. Mick Jagger, he said, I'd never sing Satisfaction over the age of 30. Well, he's still doing it, and he's, having affairs with 26-year-olds. I mean, how the hell did that happen? The notion that this might be starting to boomerang is something I haven't thought about before. And so let's go.
Right on. Now, before we end, do you have any thoughts about the federal election? Do you want to talk about the analysis you wrote for the hub.ca?
Well, I mean, we're trying to broaden beyond kind of either just narrow politics, especially narrow Canadian politics. But I mean, a lot of people are drawing the comparison between what's happening right now and 1993. For those who aren't old enough to remember that, I mean, the similarities are that much like Justin Trudeau at the time, Brian Mulroney extended his leadership kind of far beyond the best before date, and resigned in literally his fifth year of his second term in power, and really didn't leave his successor, Kim Campbell, sufficient time to rebuild the party, and they got destroyed. I happened to be heavily involved in that campaign in 1993 and got blamed for destroying a national institution, to which my father said, you got way more credit than you ever deserved when things were going well. Now you're getting way more blame. Quit reading your press clippings, buddy, which is probably very, 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 very good advice. And so anyway, the Hub reached out and said, can you do a parallel between what was happening then and happening now? And in the piece, I said, look, there are a lot of parallels on the surface, but start with the start. That was 38 years ago. And in those 38, to the very premise of this podcast, is that the world has been turned on its head. In Canada, in the 38 years, 10 million new Canadians have arrived on our shores. They have settled disproportionately in what have become known as ethnic enclaves, significant enumeration areas that contain more than 30% of one identifiable ethnic group. And you go to Brampton and, all 5 candidates are Sikhs. You go to Markham and all 5 candidates are Mandarin Chinese. And that's no different than if you go to Forest Hill and all 5 candidates are WASPs. But it creates a completely different dynamic. No political party has been able to win federally unless they've been able to capture that suburban new Canadian vote. We've talked on this show. The other thing that has changed tremendously is the mood of the country is just so much more negative 1993, we're coming off a recession, but it's nothing like it is right now. We were doing some focus groups last week. And as we do in these things, we often, start by asking a question for which everyone's got an opinion and there's no wrong answer, just to warm them up to the conversation rather than getting into what sometimes is the thick of thin things. And so the first question was, what these days are you feeling happy and optimistic about? To which, over the course of 6 focus groups, a dozen people in each one, eight to 10 people in each one, they just blankly stared at the camera for around 30 seconds. And then when they started to offer something, it was always in the future and borderline frivolous. Well, I guess I'm looking forward to spring. The weather's shitty here. I'm looking forward to a holiday. I didn't have a holiday last year. Right. And then the second question was, and what are you feeling fearful and pessimistic about? To which the look of horror just, overtook the expression of everyone who was participating in the thing. And the answers were all present, something that's happening right now. They were all massive in terms of global warming, world peace, and something that was completely and utterly beyond their control. And so that sense of helplessness also is completely different. And then the political landscape between the 1993 and 2025 was completely different. I mean, back then, the Liberals, the Tories had to literally fight 3 fights: reform in Western Canada, Ontario, and Atlantic, the Liberals, and the new Bloc Québécois at the time in the province of Quebec. Now you have nothing right of Pierre Poilievre. And so the conservative base is way, way, way higher, even if their ceiling might be a little lower. So the question is there any pathway for victory for a new Liberal leader? If you look at 1993, the answer is no. But if you look at 2025 and those differences, and also even maybe the bigger difference, is that the reasonable middle, we talk about polarization, the single largest voting bloc continues to be groups that define themselves as being in the middle ideologically. They feel wildly underrepresented by the current political leadership. Since there's polarization in Canada, it's not at the electoral level, it's at the political and party level. If conservatives, if the Liberals can elect a Mark Carney type leader, as long as he doesn't look seen as too elitist, as long as he can fight like he looks like he's a time for a change kind of candidate, someone who obviously is moving to the center, there's maybe a little bit more fiscally conservative than the options that have been available to date to the center left, then he has a chance of pushing both the Conservatives and the NDP to the periphery and having some kind of prospect. That said, if I was a betting man, would I put money on that likelihood? No. Best political slogan ever written is "Time for a Change." And that sentiment is just massive right now.
And I am grossly disappointed in Jagmeet Singh and the NDP and the way in which they've been approaching. If Charlie Angus was their leader, they would be soaring in the polls. But unfortunately, they're sitting on the sidelines on what is and should be. Wab Kinew is another future potential federal NDP prime minister. He has been very impressive guy. He has been absolutely shining. Go ahead.
And Singh will not run more than this election. This is his last election. Yeah. But I agree with you. I mean, you talk about, again, Red-Tory. I mean, the people who, I'll forget that part of the story. I mean, I don't understand why the NDP are not significantly more radical than they are. Why they don't go out there and say, well, hold on. We let Doug Ford freeze nurses' salaries for 3 years, which as time passed was deemed to be unconstitutional. But forget about unconstitutional. Morally indefensible.
Yes.
Given that we have over 1,000 people who work for the Royal Bank of Canada who earn over $1 million a year.
Yeah.
You're paying fucking nurses, $45,000 a year when some knob who's pushing, wealth management accounts around, contributing nothing to society, is getting paid over $1 million. Why shouldn't we pay all first responders, all paramedics, all fire people, all police people, all teachers, all nurses, $250,000 a year?
Yeah.
Start there. And, people say, well, that's not practical. Tell me why not.
Well, the opposite is we have devastated our healthcare system because nurses have said, I'm out of here. Like my local ER department often closes on weekends because they don't have enough nurses, fundamentally. And, Merit Stiles, I think, has an opportunity in this campaign to kind of show who she is. But I'm as equally disappointed with her and Bonnie Crombie as well. They're kind of sitting back when Doug Ford is campaigning quite effectively.
But to go back to my rant, is the fact of the matter is that we value the work that nurses do more than we value the work that hedge fund managers do. Yeah. So why would we tolerate hedge fund managers to be paid more than nurses? There's something. It is a lot of our economic thinking. Again, is crazy that way. If the Exxon Valdez crashes on the coast of Alaska and spills oil, that actually contributes to gross domestic product. If you volunteer at a soup kitchen, it provides nothing. What do we value more, oil spills or volunteerism?
Although I'm not sure I would continue to call it economic thinking. I think it is ideological. And I think part of what we're trying to do here on this show is kind of point out the things that are, at least to me, obviously ideological, but not to the rest of society. And I think part of what we've done in our election and our policy discussions is we've been very narrow about the ideological options we should entertain. Now, a few things I want to say before I forget. You don't happen to have Margaret Atwood's contact info, do you? Can we get her on the show? What a get that would be.
She is so smart. It's just crazy. It's just crazy. She always really liked me because her very first job was working in the phone bank of Gallup Research.
Right
and
on.
She loved the fact that I was a researcher, and so she and I always had it.
I think it's worth a Hail Mary. The other person that I'm going to reach out to right away, who to this conversation, I would love to hear what they have to say, is Avi Lewis.
Yes.
Because he is running for a federal election in Vancouver, and he is. Yeah, he's done a full 180. He and I years ago once had an argument where he was like saying this about himself and Naomi, that they would never get into politics, that his parents and his grandparents were sacrificed to the political machine. He would never do it. And I think he's just had enough. He realizes the climate emergency. So he is running for office. He's very out there, and he is pretty radical.
Well, I loved his dad. I mean, one of the best public speakers. I heard him one time and just sat there with my mouth open. Couldn't believe the passion and the concern and the work he did, both in politics and also as a diplomat. It was quite remarkable.
And the other thing that I want us to look at as a kind of recurring theme in future episodes is I want us to look at liberalism as an ideology. And I say this because in our lifetime, I kind of feel that it got eclipsed by neoliberalism. And neoliberalism became kind of the ruling ideology. And I want to look back at both classical liberalism and what we can learn from it. But also, where I like Mark Carney as a person and as an individual, and he is right now the best of all alternatives, I'm not sure he has the right ideas, the right framework to challenge the things that we face in the future. And again, it's not personal. I think it's ideological, and I would love for us to pick that apart.
Well, in fact, let's extend that conversation even beyond that and talk about not only liberalism and maybe even conservatism as classically, but what are the new dimensions that are played that are creating a new ism that we haven't really called yet? Because, I mean, there is an understanding, we know where liberalism and conservatism came from. It came from the Enlightenment period, from the Edmund Burkes and the Mills and the Locks. Well, a lot of shit has changed since then, since the 18th, 17th century. And there are new dimensions at work now that are driving people's thinking and creating a new ideology and new ideologies that we haven't really been able to classify in a way that helps us explain the world. And if part of our job is explaining the world, then maybe we should go there as well.
And, that I think quite conveniently brings us kind of to the end of the episode, because I was hoping we would end on kind of recommendations on stuff we're reading, links that I could throw into the show notes. Because one of the things, I don't know if I've mentioned this to you yet, but to your very point about maybe there are new ideologies emerging that we don't understand, that we need to wrap our head around. Have you heard of Curtis Yavin yet?
No.
So Curtis Yavin, Yavin, and I'll email you. He is the ideological guy behind Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and Anderson, and he's on Substack. His Substack is huge, and he is like the burn it all down far right libertarian guy who has replaced Steve Bannon, because Steve Bannon's feeling left out. Like Steve Bannon's the guy who has the class analysis going, this ain't good for working class American white guys, right? Versus...
And no one's listening to him.
No.
It's remarkable.
And Curtis Yavin is the new Steve Bannon. He's the guy who's like the new. So I'll email to you. And then you mentioned that article I sent to you, which was, I believe, slate.com, looking at Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi and how they use Substack to really swing to the far right and cash in. Clearly, we were too late. We were a couple of years too late on that. Hopefully, the pendulum's swinging to the left, and we'll be able to cash in when it gets back to us. But it was an interesting article, nonetheless. Anything you want to recommend in terms of stuff you're reading that you think our listeners should check out?
No, I got enough coming from you right now.
Right on. Okay. Thanks again, Allan. Any final thoughts before we conclude?
An hour is about as long as I can take now. I need to have a nap.
Yeah, me too. My bladder actually only goes about an hour. This is the issues with aging. So
there you go.
Thanks, everybody. Big shout out to Brian Trepanier, our first YouTube subscriber and loyal friend.
Old friend.
And Bill Fox, who sent a very friendly email. And if there are friends like that listening, we want to get you on the show. So look forward to guests and whatnot in the future. Thanks again.
Till next time. Take care.